Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more overly sarcastic productions, and today we are hitting up the Meiji restoration. Now, this one is 4 years old, so it's one of his relatively newer history summarized, as we've spoken about in the past. Some of his older ones, I am not too much of a fan on. They were the ones that I had watched, obviously, when I had found this channel back when I was in high school. Um, but they have not aged well, in my opinion, as I have learned more in regards to history. But his newer ones have typically done, I feel like, are still his newer ones, 2019 on, tend to be pretty good. So we'll see how this one ranks here. Yeah, before we dive in, though, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I would love to join the Discord and follow me over at Twitch. And please do go check out the gaming channel here on YouTube, or the gaming channels here on YouTube. By the time this video gets uploaded, it should be around the time that the second video gets uploaded over at the edited gaming channel. I plan on releasing that on June 15th. So if it is June 15th when this video is uploaded, then go on and check out the edited gaming channel. And if it's not June 15th, it's after, still go check out that channel. And if it's before, also still go check out that channel. With all that said and done, let's go ahead and dive into the video here.
If there's one thing we've learned from spamming the tech tree in a game of Civilization, it's the simple joy of rolling up to a medieval city in an M1 Abrams tank.
Dude, I'm like, when it comes to games like Civilization, all those types of games, like Hearts of Iron, this applies to as well. You can't really do it in EU4 or Crusader Kings. I like to play, well, in Crusader Kings you kind of can do this. EU4 you kind of can't really. Like when you give me a tech tree similar to that is in Civilization or Victoria 3 or Hearts of Iron 4, I'm the kind of person that kind of wants to research things for a certain amount of time and then I fight. And that playstyle, like, especially I've learned this in Victoria 3, and why I refuse to play it again, is that doesn't work. That doesn't work too well. Things don't, like, you kind of have to, in Paradox games, it seems like you have to be a bit aggressive. Hearts of Iron, you can get away with it, but then it becomes like 1945, and then it just becomes a trash game. So you also kind of have to be a bit aggressive in Hearts of Iron 4 in order to even find a semblance of joy while playing that. Anyways.
Normally, this is one of the less historically accurate parts of the game, but the big exception comes in periods of mass industrialization. Within a single lifetime, a society can start from horse-drawn carriages hauling hand-sewn shirts to the local market and end up with an arsenal of steam trains ferrying machine-made clothes halfway across a country. But once people graduate from oohing and awing at a sewing machine, they start getting creative with how to use all this newfound tech to wreak havoc. And this is where—
I mean, that sounds like a big jump, but, like, think about, at least my parents anyway, phones weren't yet international, at least for the mass consumer. TVs were, like, brand new. Oh, hold on. I'm trying to think. No, TVs weren't brand new, at least not when my parents were born. They had been around for a few years, for maybe over a decade by then. I don't remember when the TV was invented. But anyways, right, there wasn't really the idea of communication across the seas available to just the common man. Was not a thing even deemed possible. And, like, nowadays you can text some random man in Indonesia within like 5 minutes if you wanted to. Even less. You could probably hit up an Indonesian man right now in under a minute. Speedrun. Right? Like, oh, the technological leap of the last 60, 70 years is insane.
our militaries can develop truly frightening power disparities. In Europe's case, this made mass colonization an absolute breeze, but today we'll see the extreme counterexample of Japan, who covered centuries of lost ground in the space of mere decades. So, to see how Japan pulled off the world's greatest industrial reverso, Let's do some history. The first thing we have to understand is Japan's political structure at the time that this was all going down. The Japanese archipelago.
I think we also have to consider Japan's geographical structure. Japan is like a condensed nation. It has always been a fairly condensed nation throughout its history. They have been living in cities for quite some time, right? Now, of course, cities as what we see with industrialization are, of course, on a different tier than medieval cities, medieval Japanese cities, right? But like, look at the mountains. Look at how Japan is just laid out. This is a condensed nation, so there are going to be urban centers. Because of that ability of urban, already pre-existing kind of culture of like urbanization within Japan, I feel like that's something that's under talked about when we talk about the rapid industrialization of Japan and why they were really able to be successful in, and why like Russia wasn't really able to, or China. China and Russia are massive nations with lots of distance, and so they don't have that like easily movable kind of culture, you know. Whereas Japan was able to just like, you know, yeah, we got cities, let's get going.
Archipelago had been ruled by an emperor for thousands of years, but since roughly the first millennium, real power belongs to a military leader known as the shogun. The emperor remained the figurehead and the symbolic ruler of Japan, but the shogun had all the samurais, so he was really the one in charge. That said, medieval Japan wasn't centralized in the slightest, and most governing was in the hands of local daimyo, who were basically mob bosses for samurai. But the problem with big sword politics is that it's vulnerable to other people with large stabby sticks, so several daimyo took swipes at the shogun, and in 1467, Japan broke into a century and a half of all-out war. On paper, few things on Earth are cooler than samurai war, but few things are also more disruptive to well-being than 148 years of constant conflict. Things got even dicier with the arrival of European traders, whose show and tell exhibit included Christianity and guns. Well, Jesus didn't particularly.
And then Japan was fucking like, guns? Let's become the nation with the most fucking guns within this time period. Absolutely insane.
Really affect the trajectory of the war, firearms made a much bigger and bloodier splash. This mercifully wrapped up at the start of the 1600s when Tokugawa Ieyasu won the war and reasserted shogun supremacy. For the next 250 years.
Not even talking about Nobunaga, huh? The first great unifier, just going into Tokugawa Ieyasu as the... Okay, I mean, I can understand that. But I think Oda Nobunaga should be mentioned before Tokugawa.
Years, the Tokugawa family ruled a finally peaceful Japan from their new capital.
But also, like, I understand this, again, because the Tokugawa era is the one that ends with the Meiji Restoration, so...
At Edo.
And the Oda Nobunaga period still had some tensions, violence, uncertainty about unity in Japan. So I understand.
And their government had one priority above literally everything else: keep the peace. The shogunate confiscated swords from everyone except samurai, they implemented a strict class hierarchy, and they closed Japan to any and all foreigners. Except the Dutch. They're cool, they can stay. Even into the start of the 1800s, Japanese society vaguely resembled medieval Europe, where the country was unified but not centralized. For one thing, taxes were chaos to manage, as the 300 daimyo set their own tax rates and only collected payment in goods. Meanwhile, the common people had to work hard and even endure famines while their taxes paid for samurai to do kendo and write poetry in their abundant free time. This, of course, begs the question of why is there still a warrior class if we're not supposed to have wars anymore? While the Edo period saved Japan from civil war, 2.5 centuries is a long time to just stay in place. People were hungry, samurai were useless, daimyo were antsy, and also there's a gunship in the harbor. See, hot on the heels of Britain steamrolling China in the Opium Wars, European powers were systematically siphoning wealth out of Asia because what else is an empire supposed to do? At the same time, America was...
That's the funny thing, and it was something that, you know, it's one of those things that is subconsciously you're aware of, but you're not really actively thinking about. It took Rebecca Kwong's Babel, because she says the same line in that book where it was imperialism fuels its own destruction or something like that. And I was like, it was one of those lines where you like, you read it and you're like, huh. And you think about it and you're like, you shut the book and you're like, damn, she correct. Because again, the goal of colonialism is to pull resources out and fuel the homeland, right? With raw material. And then sell that finished material to other nations or back to the colonies, um, as was the case in like with the the 13 colonies. Um, but in so doing, pulling these raw resources out is you are just destroying the colonized land because you are not building up anything. You are just taking away, and so like it's going to inevitably become just useless.
Westward expanding so fast that they blew past the Pacific coast and kept on going until west became east and they bumped right into Japan. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry arrived with a fleet of gunships and requested the opening of trade relations on the basis of do it or else. With the intimidating might of a steam-powered gunship fleet and one model train, America forced Japan to accept wildly imbalanced trading terms, full access to merchant ports, no export taxes, and legal immunity to merchants and diplomats. Soon enough, half of Europe had similar treaties with Japan, and the Shogun was powerless to stop it. Japan recognized that America's threats and China's recent thrashing was a warning to shape up or get whacked because there was no way they could resist an invasion, and so far they'd only been experiencing colonization light, with zero military occupation and same exploitation. Hurdle number one was technology, because steam-powered transportation and high-accuracy shooty sticks made for a massive imbalance. But since they were trading, daimyo and samurai across Japan now had access to rifles and artillery, and some of them started pointing the barrels at the shogun. In 1868, he tried to quash this insubordination, but an alliance of the Satsuma and Chosu domains not only beat the shogun's army, they routed him all the way up to the imperial capital of Kyoto, proclaimed a restoration of imperial authority under the teenage Emperor Meiji, and demanded the dissolution of the shogunate. That is one heck of a reversal, but it didn't stop there. The shogun declared war to try and save his skin, but the pro-imperial forces were far better equipped, so they hammered him all the way up Japan and out to the island of Hokkaido. So, some 7 centuries after the first shogunate, the emperor was restored to power. Now, our boyo Meiji was all set for life, but there was still the problem of all those predatory colonizers, so him and his advisors, but mostly advisors, wasted zero time in reforming Japan. The first order of business was reconfiguring the country from a fractured society of feudal lords into a centralized nation-state. That meant sending all of the daimyo into a cushy early retirement and converting their domains into imperial prefectures. And with land reform came standardized taxes, paid with a shiny new currency system which gave the government steady revenue for the first time in literally forever. This afforded Japan the cash to pay for new infrastructure like railway networks and telecom lines. Although Japanese industry was starting from scratch, the emperor was proactive in hiring consultants from all over Europe to come and advise the project, so Japan looked like it was time-skipping full centuries ahead. Really shows how innovation can snowball fast. All this newfound unity also depended on people and a national Japanese identity, so Meiji's second priority was disassembling Japan's rigid social hierarchy of samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants. Samurai, like the daimyo, were given a pension and politely forced to retire, while the other 3 tiers were brought up to equal status. The caveat is that women—
Honestly, that's gotta be so cushy though. Like, imagine being this warrior class and then the emperor is like, yo, how about you just don't cause me problems and you get to retire early? And like, let's say you're a samurai that inherited young. You're like a 20-year-old something samurai. I'm assuming this applies to them, because if so, that'd be great. One could hope. And the emperor's just like, yeah, here's a pension. This will last you the rest of the life. Though, let's see, you'd be in your 60s or 80s by the time World War II rolls around, and that's not a good time. Make sure to die. Be just old enough to die before World War II.
Women were still held in lower regard than men and expected to be good wives, wise mothers, and dutiful laborers in the new textile factories. However, there is a caveat to this caveat, as both boys and girls were given 4 years of education. It was clear that sending out scholars to copy Europe's homework would only get Japan so far, so they made a point to give all kiddos the smarts to become Japan's next innovators. And though this may have looked like another copy-paste of Western schooling, it encouraged a distinct Japanese identity through the teaching of national culture and a standardized Japanese language. Additionally, these schools co-opted elements of the Bushido Code. Historically, it wasn't much more than a loyalty oath between a samurai and his daimyo, but it was
Let's see. Published in 1900, this book is our primary source for the samurai code, but its historical value is iffy because it's so late and was written for Westerners. Yeah, I mean, so the fact that it was written for Westerners, I wouldn't necessarily say Nazu Nitobi. I mean, by published in 1900, so they would have had plenty of time to really actually get to know Westerners and Western value. So it definitely could have been written and worded differently to align more so with Yeah, especially the way in which we talk about the samurai. You can definitely see how we how we really relate it to medieval knights and chivalry. Which now that I'm actively thinking, I'm like maybe, especially when you also consider how different Eastern values were based what we do know about Eastern values um before colonization. Um they tended to be pretty fairly different from Western European. So yeah, now I'm wondering how accurate actually what we believe to know of the samurai code is accurate. Huh.
Was embellished with honor and virtue to echo European chivalry and fully mythologized into a pillar of Japanese identity. Meanwhile, in art, sculptors and painters
And also that can be used to talk about the Japanese problem of talking about their past. We've talked about this before. We've seen some people mention it, that Japan has a little bit of a problem with its past in a different way than Germany. Japan doesn't necessarily do the best when it comes like. Supposedly, I've heard some people in the comments have said that Japan has been doing better in recent years, but still they have that historical trend of not being the best at acknowledging and apologizing for their historical past.
alike were incorporating Western techniques to create totally new works, and painting developed into two new styles: Yoga, which was naturalistic and very photoreal, and Nihonga, which was very traditional and stylized. In architecture, Western building materials found use in Japanese designs, and in 1889, the emperor lifted a ban on Hanafuda playing cards, so a new little company called Nintendo began
Never heard of
printing
it.
them. So when you fire up Breath of the Wild, say thanks to your old pal Meiji. Now, beyond a centralized government and a unified populace, Japan desperately needed some defenses against bigger and stockier European militaries. That meant echoing the big boys and creating a Western-style conscript army with 3 years of mandatory
Wasn't Nintendo founded by a samurai? Like, weren't like a lot of the big Japanese companies founded by samurai now that they were kind of pushed out of their traditional roles
service
in
where
society?
everybody fought as Japanese soldiers rather than bands of dubiously loyal samurai. And speaking of, this was their last slap in the face. They lost their social rank and their military honor, and their stipends were yanked too. Meiji saw them as a relic that was too dangerous to use and too expensive to not use. In 1877, the samurai of Satsuma tried to rebel against this affront to their dignity, but the army stomped them and axed the samurai for good, which, hey, reforms worked. Now, all of these changes beg the question of whether modern could exist outside of Western.
It's time for a fun game of how much bias, casual racism, and full-on propaganda can we shove into this dodgy allegory for bullying Japan into modernity.
And since Japan was the first outside nation to the post-industrial party, they had to figure out for themselves if they could meaningfully remain Japanese despite enjoying all of this progress. We definitely do not have the time to cover all of the biases baked into the concept of development, but for Japan's purposes, the one key trait that kept them distinct from Europe was the emperor. Sure, Europe had monarchs aplenty, but they weren't as culturally and nationally vital as the emperor, especially now that Meiji was head honcho again. So even when Japan adopted a constitution in 1889 with a prime minister, cabinet, bicameral, and slightly elected legislature, that constitution was officially a gift from Emperor Meiji, and he remains the focal point of Japanese pride and identity, even if Meiji maybe left all of the governing to his advisors. And this idea of Japan being unique from and even in competition with the West became a driving principle of their foreign policy, as they began freeing Asia from the grip of Western imperialism with Japanese imperialism.
Yay!
Alrighty, let's see how this all goes wrong. So, in 1879, they annexed the Ryukyu Islands, and in 1894, they nabbed Korea on the logic that, hey, if not us, it would have been some Westerners, and besides, we can help you to modernize. Koreans weren't thrilled, and they called in China for backup, but Japan absolutely thrashed China and annexed Taiwan afterwards because, heck, why not? If you're seeing any parallels to the Fire Nation, that's intentional. Japan also got more suspicious of the West, who ended the unequal treaties, but were also pushing to deny this new sphere of influence. This might have worked against the Shogunate in 1853, but we're in the 1900s now, and Japan was 4 training montages stronger, so they rolled up to nearby Russia and utterly flattened them. This surprised pretty much everybody, and Russia's monumental embarrassment only fueled Japan's newfound imperialistic pride. In 1912, Emperor Meiji died after 44 years on the throne, but the empire kept on growing. Though Japan got to sit at the treaty table after World War I, suspicion of the West only deepened as Britain and France went on a massive
British and French spoils of war include going halvesies on the Ottoman Empire, confiscating German Africa, dismantling the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and partitioning Poland out from Germany. Basically, the bad guys no longer get to exist, and we keep what they aren't using anymore.
Post-war land grab. Japan tried to include a racial equality clause in the preamble to the new League of Nations, but big shock, it got voted down. So now Japan felt like all this post-war high-fiving.
That one is hardly ever talked. Actually, it's like never fucking talked about. Huh. I never knew that up until today. Okay.
Was just making an ever smaller cool kids club of who gets to do empire, which, well, inspired by this attitude as well as their unbroken string of victories, Japan's military became more dominant in politics, and in 1932 they invaded Manchuria with a push into China proper in 1937. By 1940 they expanded south into French Indochina, and America issued
I definitely think we've gone beyond the Meiji Restoration.
An oil embargo against Japan to try and keep them in check. The next year, Japan tried to go 2 for 2 on Western smackdowns and bombed America's Pearl Harbor. And by 1942, the Japanese Empire encompassed nearly all of East Asia, yoinking the American Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and Thailand. Needless to say, this did not last, and Japan was forcibly disempired in 1945. So, what can we learn from this century of the Meiji Restoration and Japanese imperialism? Well, it's as much an instruction manual as it is a cautionary tale. First off, it's an excellent role model for how any country, even one isolated in place for 250 years, can actually flourish into something greater. And it also shows that modernity will look slightly different for everybody, that there isn't some single formula for how society should be. But of course, it's impossible to detangle this modernizing renaissance from Japan's runaway imperialism. And since there's no simple culprit, this period offers a great chance to investigate just what can lead a state like Japan down the slope to imperial villainy, from self-defense to growing national hubris to carte blanche conquest. As with Europe, as with Asia, imperialism is a hell of a drug. Thank you so much for
And that was History Summarized, the Meiji Restoration, and this was a good video by Blue. I thought he covered it pretty fucking well. Yeah, I'm happy with it. I hope you guys enjoyed it too. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.